Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be talking about something, something that's a little bit hidden, I guess you could say, the struggles of long-term unemployment, but not just for anybody. We're really focusing on people who you would think would have it easy. People with experience, professionals, college degrees, all that. You'd think those folks would bounce right back, right? But that's not always the case, as we're about to find out. And our guide for this deep dive is Ofer Sharone's book, The Stigma Trap. And let me tell you, it is really eye-opening.
One of the things that's so interesting about this book is that it takes something that I think a lot of us take for granted.
Yeah.
You know, that idea that if you just work hard, you get a good education, you'll be set, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of turns that on its head. He argues that it's actually a myth.
Yeah, and he doesn't just say it, he shows it. He opens the book with this story of a guy named Larry. Larry's got a PhD in mathematics from MIT, decades of experience in the tech industry. You'd think he'd be fine.
You would think.
But after a period of unemployment, guess what he ends up doing? He ends up as a cashier at a department store.
You know, Larry's story is really just a very powerful illustration of how even accomplished individuals can really be derailed by forces that are beyond their control. And Sharone uses Larry's experience to dismantle this idea of meritocracy, basically saying, look, it's not just about individual effort. There are systemic factors that make it really difficult to find work, even if you're highly qualified.
Yeah, and one of those factors, maybe the biggest one, is this whole stigma surrounding unemployment. And the book really gets into how the stigma plays out in the real world, especially for these folks who were once high achievers.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, the way he approaches this is he actually talks to recruiters. He goes straight to the source. And he asks them, what are your hiring practices? How do you do it? And what he finds is that recruiters often use what they call red flags. These are shortcuts to weed out candidates. And guess what a huge red flag is?
Oh, I think I know this one.
Being unemployed for more than 6 months.
So wait a minute, so you're telling me that someone who might be employed but not as qualified might get chosen over someone who's unemployed who might actually be a better fit.
That's exactly what he's saying.
That's crazy.
It's a paradox.
It is.
And it's,
Yeah.
you're considered less hireable because you haven't been hired recently.
Yeah.
It's circular logic, and it's incredibly frustrating. But it doesn't even stop there. He even found that the reasons for your unemployment gap matter. So if you took time off to care for a child, that's often perceived very differently than if you just couldn't find a job.
Oh, wow. So like every little detail is being judged, and these judgments can have a huge impact on someone's chances of getting hired. The book also gets into this whole thing about overqualification. You'd think having more experience would be a good thing, but apparently it can actually work against you.
Yeah, he talks about why this happens. So a lot of times you have these experienced professionals who might be trying to step down into more junior roles.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they get rejected because the employer just assumes, oh, they're going to be unhappy, or they're going to want higher pay, or they're going to leave as soon as they find something else.
So basically they're seen as risky.
A risky hire.
Yeah. There's this one story in the book about a former school principal who wanted to transition into being a guidance counselor, which is something that he genuinely wanted to do, but he kept getting rejected because employers thought he'd be too expensive, even though he was totally willing to take a pay cut. But he couldn't even get his foot in the door to explain that.
Which is so interesting because,
Yeah.
we tell people to be truthful on their resumes, but he can't even be truthful about that.
Right.
And, it's so interesting. What ends up happening is some people even take off their advanced degrees from their resumes just to seem less intimidating.
Wow. Speaking of trying to appear less intimidating, the book also mentions how LinkedIn profiles can be a real source of stress for experienced professionals. You have these older workers who are worried about age discrimination. So they don't want to put a photo up,
Right.
but then recruiters think it's suspicious if there's no photo.
It's like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
It's a catch-22.
Yeah. And unfortunately,
Yeah.
it just underscores how age and experience, which you would think would be assets,
Yeah.
can be perceived as liabilities in this job market that often prioritizes youth.
Okay, so we've talked about the job market itself, but what about networking? Isn't that supposed to be like the key to finding a job?
Yeah, you always hear it's not what you know, it's who you know.
Yeah.
But Sharone actually found in his research, even networking has its own set of challenges, especially for those who are long-term unemployed. So he interviewed these alumni from MIT's Sloan School of Management. And initially, they were all about helping fellow grads, network and find jobs. But their enthusiasm went way down when they learned that the person they were talking to had been unemployed for a long time.
Wow, so even in this network of highly accomplished individuals, that stigma still rears its head.
Absolutely. And it transforms networking
Yeah.
from a process of connection and support into this performance where you're constantly trying to prove that you're not damaged goods. It's
Yeah.
exhausting. It's demoralizing.
Absolutely. There's I think it's an alum in the book who says that a year of unemployment wouldn't fly in the current job market. And this is at a time when long-term unemployment was at a historic high.
It's just that disconnect.
Yeah, they're completely out of touch.
Yeah, people who haven't experienced it have these deeply ingrained assumptions about it. They think, oh, they must be lazy or they're not trying hard enough.
Right.
And that thinking just perpetuates the stigma.
So instead of it being a source of support, it becomes this pressure cooker situation where you're trying to hide your desperation,
Sure.
put on a brave face, when secretly you feel like you're begging for a chance.
And he has these quotes in the book where people talk about, feeling like a used car salesman,
Yeah.
having to constantly sell themselves, downplay their struggles just to make a connection. And you can imagine how draining that must be.
And that's just the external pressure. What about the internal impact? The book talks about how long-term unemployment can lead to, shame, self-blame, anxiety.
It gets internalized.
It does.
Yeah. He talks about how people feel ashamed to be seen at home or at the gym during the workday because it means they're not working. They're absorbing society's judgment.
Even when no one is explicitly saying anything.
Exactly.
It's like you're living in this constant state of fear, like everyone is judging you.
And even things that should be enjoyable, like spending time with your family, become tainted by the stress and anxiety.
Right, because let's face it, the financial pressure is immense, especially for people who are used to a certain lifestyle. They see their savings dwindle, debts pile up. It can be incredibly stressful.
He shares some really heart-wrenching stories about, people losing their homes or having to make major sacrifices just to get by.
Imagine going from being like this successful professional to having to move back in with your parents in your 50s.
Yeah.
That's got to be tough.
And that financial strain puts pressure on relationships.
Oh, absolutely.
Spouses, start questioning your efforts, pushing you to take any job, even if it's not a good fit.
Right. There's this one story that really stuck with me. It was about this guy who felt like his marriage was only surviving because he was still able to financially support his wife.
Wow.
It just highlights how much weight is put on the breadwinner.
Yeah.
And even when spouses are supportive, it's hard for them to understand what you're going through.
Unless they've been there.
Right, unless they've experienced it themselves. And friendships aren't immune either. You lose that connection you had with colleagues. And friends, even with the best intentions, often don't know what to say.
He has this quote from someone
Yeah.
who said they felt like they were living a lie. They were hiding their unemployment from their friends.
Because they were so ashamed.
Yep.
And that feeling of shame is so pervasive. And it's often reinforced by all this self-help advice out there that puts the blame on the job seeker. It's all about attitude and effort.
And Sharone really pushes back on that narrative. He even mentions Richard Bowles, who wrote, "What color is your parachute?" Which, if you've ever looked for a job, you've probably heard of this book.
Oh, yeah.
It's very famous. And Bowles is a huge proponent of the idea that job seekers have complete control over their outcomes. But Sharon's research shows that that just isn't true. It ignores all of these barriers that people face.
Yeah, blaming yourself when you're already feeling down is like adding insult to injury.
Yeah, it's counterproductive.
It is.
It makes things worse.
So we've painted a pretty bleak picture. But the book doesn't just leave us hanging there, right? Does Sharone offer any solutions? What can people do to kind of break free from this stigma trap?
That's a great question. And luckily he does. He doesn't just diagnose the problem. He actually proposes solutions at both the individual and societal level.
Okay, well, I'm definitely curious to hear more about that. But I think that's a good place to pause for now. Let our listeners digest all this information.
It's a lot.
It is. So to our listeners, thanks for joining us for part 1 of this deep dive into the stigma trap. Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve into those potential solutions and explore what we can do, both as individuals and as a society, to challenge the stigma surrounding long-term unemployment.
See you soon.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the stigma trap. If you're just joining us, we're talking about Ofer Sharone's work on the hidden struggles of long-term unemployment, especially for experienced professionals. In the last part, we talked about how the stigma surrounding unemployment plays out in the job market and the toll it takes on individuals. So now let's shift gears a bit and talk about potential solutions.
One of the things that Sharone highlights is the role of public policy in either reinforcing or challenging this stigma. And he points out that the United States, compared to a lot of other developed countries, has a pretty stingy unemployment benefit system.
Yeah, it's true. The book mentions how in the US, unemployment benefits usually only last for like 6 months, and they replace a really small part of your previous salary. But then you look at places like Denmark, benefits can last for 2 years and replace a much larger portion of your income. So it just makes you wonder if those policy differences reflect kind of different attitudes toward unemployment in general.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And the book kind of argues that the U.S. system, with its limited duration and low replacement rate, seems to operate under this assumption that people should be able to find new jobs really quickly. And if they can't, well, maybe they're just not trying hard enough.
Yeah.
It goes back to that myth of meritocracy that we were talking about.
So the structure of our unemployment system might actually be reinforcing this idea that if you're unemployed for a long time, it's your fault somehow.
It's one way to interpret it. And it can kind of create this culture where people are less likely to support policies that would provide more generous assistance.
Because they see it as a handout.
Exactly.
Not a safety net.
Not a safety net.
But what if we shift our perspective a little bit? What if we see unemployment as a societal issue, not just a personal failing? Wouldn't it make sense to have a more robust safety net in place?
Absolutely. And, Sharone suggests that. A more generous unemployment benefit system, both in terms of how long it lasts and how much it replaces your income, could go a long way toward
reducing the financial strain and the anxiety that goes along with long-term unemployment.
It would give people more breathing room to focus on their job search without constantly worrying about, how am I going to pay rent?
Exactly.
How am I going to put food on the table? And wouldn't it also send a message that as a society, we value and support people even when they're going through a rough patch?
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that, unemployment can happen to anyone. It's not always a reflection of their skills or their work ethic. And the book also talks about this idea of a universal basic income, or UBI, as a potential solution.
UBI, yeah. I feel like that's been getting a lot of buzz lately, and it's really interesting to think about how it ties into the themes of this book. But just to remind our listeners, UBI is basically this idea of ensuring that everyone has a basic level of income, regardless of whether or not they have a job.
But I know some people push back on that. And they say, well, wouldn't that discourage people from working?
Yeah, that's one of the common criticisms. But the book argues that a basic income could actually free people up to pursue more meaningful work, or to start their own businesses, or take care of their families, without this fear of financial ruin hanging over their heads.
So instead of feeling trapped in these jobs that they hate just to survive, they would actually have choices.
Choices and flexibility. And it really gets at this idea of decoupling our worth from our ability to earn a wage.
Yeah.
Challenging this belief that our value is tied to our job title.
I love that.
It's a big idea.
It is.
And it probably wouldn't be an easy sell in a society that's so focused on individual achievement.
Yeah. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, that whole thing.
Exactly. But this book encourages us to at least consider these alternative approaches, to think outside the box. Because if we're serious about addressing this problem, we can't just keep doing things the way they've always been done.
Right. So besides these big picture policy solutions, what can individuals do to cope with this stigma and just navigate the day-to-day challenges of long-term unemployment? Because let's face it, policy changes take time.
Right.
And people need help now.
One of the key takeaways from this book and from Sharone's work with the Institute for Career Transitions is the importance of social support, connecting with other people who understand what you're going through, who can validate your experience and offer encouragement can make a huge difference.
It's like that saying, you don't know how strong you are until being strong is your only choice.
It makes me think about all those stories that we were talking about before, about people feeling so isolated and ashamed. Imagine how powerful it would be to have someone say, hey, I've been there, I get it, you're not alone.
That validation can be so powerful. It can counteract all those negative messages that we tell ourselves.
Right, like, I'm a failure, or I'm not good enough.
Exactly. But we also talked about how, even with the best of intentions, friends and family might not always know how to be supportive.
Right, especially if they haven't been through it.
Exactly. So how do you have those conversations without pushing people away?
That's a really good question. And Sharone really emphasizes the importance of open and honest communication, being upfront about your needs, letting people know how they can support you.
So instead of suffering in silence, you're actually inviting people into your experience, giving them a chance to be there for you.
Exactly. It's also about setting boundaries. You
Yeah.
don't have to share everything with everyone,
Right.
but being selective about who you confide in can make a big difference.
And it's also about educating people, right? Helping them understand the realities of this,
Absolutely.
the stigma.
The more we talk about it,
Right.
the more we normalize it,
Yeah.
and the less power it has over us.
Okay, so we talked about policy, we've talked about social support. Are there any other things, like concrete steps that individuals can take to combat the stigma and improve their chances of finding work? What about all that self-help advice that's out there?
Yeah, well, we talked about how some of it can be pretty damaging,
Hmm.
especially when it focuses so much on individual effort.
Right.
But there's some practical things that people can do
Yeah.
that can be helpful and don't involve blaming yourself.
Like what? Give us some examples.
One thing that came up in Sharone's research was this idea of reframing your job search as a job in itself.
Okay.
So setting a schedule, treating it like a full-time commitment, focusing on building your skills, your network, rather than just kind of passively applying for jobs online.
So giving yourself some structure
Structure.
when you might be feeling lost and aimless.
Right.
It's like taking back some control
It's taking back control.
over a situation that can feel very much out of your control.
Exactly. And it helps you avoid that trap of feeling like
Right.
you're not doing enough or you're lazy because you're not currently employed.
So instead of beating yourself up for not having a real job,
Yeah.
you're actually acknowledging the work
Huh.
that goes into finding one.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that.
Another practical tip is to really focus on your transferable skills. So thinking about the skills that you've developed in your previous roles. That could be applied to different industries, different positions,
Well, you're opening yourself up.
opening yourself up to a wider range of possibilities.
Yeah, I've heard that before. But I think the hard part for me would be translating those skills into language that makes sense to employers.
And that's where networking can actually be helpful. Talking to people in different fields, understanding their work, how your skills might align with their needs.
So being proactive,
Proactive.
curious,
Theory.
instead of just waiting for the perfect opportunity to come along.
And seeing your skills as assets, not liabilities.
It's about shifting that mindset from, I'm overqualified, to, I have a lot to offer.
Exactly.
I love that. But if networking can be so tricky for people who are long-term unemployed, are there any specific strategies that can make it feel less daunting, maybe a little more authentic?
That's something we're going to talk about in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to get into some specific strategies for networking, building your resilience, and advocating for change.
Okay, sounds like we have a lot more to cover. So to our listeners, stay tuned for part 3, where we'll continue to explore the stigma trap and give you even more tools and insights to navigate this challenge of long-term unemployment. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the stigma trap. We've talked about a lot, everything from those biases in the job market to that really tough emotional toll that long-term unemployment can take. But as we wrap things up, I'm really curious to hear more about those networking strategies we talked about. Like, how can people approach networking in a way that feels authentic and empowering, especially when they're facing, this invisible stigma?
That's a great question. And it's something that Sharone really addresses head on in the book. He says one of the most important things is to kind of shift your mindset about networking. Instead of seeing it as this like transactional thing, where you're just trying to get something from people, try to approach it as a way to build genuine connections.
So it's less about what can you do for me and more about how can we learn from each other?
Exactly. It's about being curious, asking questions, really listening to what other people have to say. And it's also about offering value to the other person, whether that's sharing your insights, connecting them with someone in your network, or even just offering a listening ear. And when you approach networking with this kind of mindset, it feels less like a chore and more like a natural part of, how you interact with people anyway.
Yeah, that makes it less scary. But what about that fear of being judged or dismissed, because of your employment status? How do you have those conversations without feeling like you have to hide part of yourself?
It's a challenge for sure. But one of the things that came up in Sharone's research was the power of vulnerability. And that doesn't mean you have to overshare with everyone, but it does mean being honest about your situation and what you're looking for.
So instead of trying to downplay it or pretend everything is fine, you're actually being upfront about your unemployment.
Exactly.
Huh.
And what's interesting is that When you're vulnerable like that, it can actually disarm people. It creates a sense of trust, and it allows for these more authentic connections to form. And you might be surprised by how willing people are to help when they feel like you're being genuine.
It makes sense. People connect with you more when you're being your true self.
Right.
But I imagine it takes courage to put yourself out there like that, especially when you're already feeling vulnerable.
Absolutely. And that's where building resilience comes in. The job search process can be brutal, especially when you're facing rejection after rejection.
Yeah.
It's really easy to internalize those rejections and start to feel like you're not good enough.
Like all those judgments we talked about start to creep into how you see yourself.
Exactly. So it's really important to find ways to cope, ways to bounce back from those setbacks. This might be things like practicing self-care, focusing on your accomplishments, or maybe even seeking support from a therapist or a career coach.
Yeah. You got to remember that your worth is not defined by your job.
Exactly.
It's about giving yourself permission to feel those tough emotions without letting them, take over.
And it's also about celebrating those small wins. Like
Yeah.
every interview you get, every networking connection, every skill you learn, those are all steps in the right direction. It's important to acknowledge those and give yourself credit for all that hard work.
It's like you're building up resilience
Building it up, yeah.
by brick. But it's not just about individual resilience, is it?
No.
This book also talks about the need for collective action to address those big systemic things that are keeping this stigma in place.
Exactly. One of the most powerful ways to fight stigma is just to talk about it openly and honestly. The more we share our stories, the more we challenge those misconceptions about long-term unemployment.
And the more we create a culture of empathy.
Empathy and support. Yeah.
So it's about using our voices to advocate for change,
Yeah,
both in our personal lives and on a bigger level.
absolutely. This might mean speaking out against discriminatory hiring practices, supporting policies that provide a better safety net, or even just educating people about what long-term unemployment is really like.
It's about changing that whole narrative from what's wrong with you to how can we fix this broken system?
Exactly.
Wow. Well, this deep dive has been really eye-opening, but also kind of, a little bit heavy, I guess.
Tough topic.
It is. But I think the most important takeaway for me is we don't have to go through this alone.
No, we don't.
Whether it's reaching out to friends and family, connecting with others who get it, or speaking up for change. There are things we can do to break free from this stigma trap. So, to our listeners, we hope this has given you a better understanding of this issue and maybe even inspired you to take action. Remember, change starts with all of us.
Thanks for listening.
And until next time, keep diving deep.